Welcome to the Connor's Corner segment of Ask the Lawyer. Right now, we're very privileged to have as our guest Anders Rasmussen, former Prime Minister of Denmark. How are you doing today, sir?
Fine, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be on your show.
So you have a book out, The Will to Lead, America's Indispensable Role in the Global Fight for Freedom. Now, the title says a lot, but what is the book about?
The book is about the need for determined American global leadership. Actually, I propose that the United States acts as the world's policeman, because the world is on fire and we need someone to restore international law and order, and I don't see other candidates for that post than the United States. So this is the main message in my book.
Okay, now, there are a lot of people in the United States who say, hey, it's not the job of the American military to be the world's policeman. What would you say to them?
I would say to them, I understand your concerns, but think about the U.S. self-interest. You have a self-interest in being the world's policeman. First of all, because if you don't strike enemies on their soil, they will hit you on your soil. We saw that on 9/11. And next is also in your own interest to act as the world's policeman, because prevention is less expensive than treatment or cure. So it's in the U.S. interest to knock down conflicts and prevent conflicts while they're still small, instead of sitting idly by on the fence and see them growing big and unmanageable. That's exactly what we saw in the 30s, in the run-up to the Second World War. And finally, I would tell people that it is in U.S. self-interest to uphold the world order you created so successfully yourself after the Second World War, but then Truman created a rules-based world centered around a number of institutions. And since then, nations all over the world have more or less followed rules. And it is in the U.S. self-interest to uphold peace and this rules-based order. The U.S. prospers when the world is at peace and people follow certain rules. So that would be my argument, that it is in your self-interest to actually spend resources on being the world's policeman.
What would you recommend that the United States do today to be the world's policeman? What should they be doing that they're not doing?
It is a fact that during the Obama administration, the U.S. has been too reluctant, in my opinion, to use military force, or at least threaten to use military force. So that's actually what is needed. For instance, in your relations with Russia, I think the U.S. should pursue a more tough-minded approach to Russia, both in Ukraine and in Syria, just to mention one example.
Some people would say that's easy for you to say, but it's American troops that may go in those places.
I also understand that argument and that concern. When I speak to Europeans, I also tell the Europeans, you should, as Europeans, invest much more in our common security, and at least you should live up to the so-called 2% benchmark within NATO. That is, you should invest at least 2% of your total production in defense. Today is only 5 out of 28 NATO allies that fulfill the 2% benchmark. So I fully agree with all the Americans who argue that the Europeans should invest much more. and I have told the Europeans that. The good news is that the Europeans have learned after Putin's aggression against Ukraine that they should invest much more, and in 2016 they invest more than in 2015.
You were Secretary General of NATO. How do you think NATO should respond to the Russians in the Ukraine?
First and foremost, I think NATO should further strengthen its territorial defense by increasing its presence in Eastern Europe, for instance, in the three Baltic states, in Poland, etc. The good news is that NATO has decided to do so. So in the coming months and years, NATO allies will increase their military presence in the East, not to provoke war, but to deter Russia from even thinking about attacking a NATO ally. And if Russia continues her provocations, I think NATO should consider further strengthening its territorial defense, in particular in Eastern Europe.
So in the Baltic states, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I would recommend if Russia continues to provoke European countries, I would argue that we need a more permanent military presence in the Baltic states, and that might include the establishment of military bases in the three Baltic states to make sure that we can act swiftly if someone were to attack the three Baltic states.
Counter argument, you say you're really just aggravating the Russians and you're threatening them. They're really not a threat to the U.S. And aren't you threatening Russia by building a presence in the Baltic states and Poland and Ukraine?
I have two comments on that. Firstly, what we do is only defensive. It's not offensive. We are not threatening Russia in any way. No NATO ally has ever thought about attacking Russia. So it's not justified when the Russians claim that NATO constitutes a threat against Russia. My second comment is that while the three Baltic states are located at far distance from the U.S., it is in U.S. interest to make sure that the U.S. is still engaged in European security. If the U.S. were to withdraw from Europe, I'm sure that Mr. Putin would advance, that Russia would advance, and all of a sudden the U.S. Would see a more hostile Europe on the eastern shore of the Atlantic, and that wouldn't be in the U.S. interest.
The Middle East, Syria. How should the United States government act in reference to the Middle East, specifically Syria?
Well, the situation in Syria is very, very complicated. It is really an example of what happens when the U.S. does not intervene. It's always very easy to criticize the U.S. when the U.S. acts, but Syria, where 300,000 people are killed and more than 10 million people are refugees, is a tragic example of the costs of inaction. However, I think something could be done. First of all, I think a new administration should introduce a no-fly zone along Jordan's and Turkey's borders so that refugees could seek refuge under secure circumstances. And we should also step up our military assistance to the moderate opposition in Syria. Obviously, there is no military solution to the conflict in Syria. Only a political solution could be durable and sustainable, but to impose such a political solution, we need some military pressure.
Your book is a little bit of a history lesson, too, and you bring up former presidents and their role in leadership, Harry Truman, John Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan. You want to just elaborate on that for a minute?
Yeah, I have already mentioned Truman's big contribution to establishing the world order that has created an unprecedented era of growth and peace and prosperity. But I would also highlight President Kennedy's contribution, in particular his inaugural speech in January 1961. In that inaugural speech, he said, "We Americans, we will pay any price and bear any burden to defend our friends, to oppose our foes, and protect liberty." And that's the strongest commitment to American global leadership I've ever heard. I hope the next president will make a similar statement January 2017. And finally, I have also highlighted President Reagan because his firm conviction that capitalism and classical liberalism are much stronger forces than communism helped end the Cold War peacefully. So this is a reason why in my book I have highlighted President Truman, Kennedy, and Reagan, and I express the hope that the next president of the U.S. in one and the same person would encapsulate the main features of these three presidents.
What do you think is the future of Europe, in the next 20, 30 years?
In a way, I'm a bit pessimistic about Europe, at least if Europe does not carry out necessary reforms. Europe has a huge potential, but right now Europe is on the brink of collapse, partly because it's threatened security-wise by the Russian aggression in the east. On top of that, you also have Brexit, that the UK will leave the European Union within a couple of years. Furthermore, you have the immigrant refugee crisis, and the euro crisis is far from over. So all that leads to the conclusion that Europe needs fundamental reforms, and I also think we need to strengthen the transatlantic bond between Europe and the United States, in particular, the trade bonds. And this is a reason why in my book I argue that the next president should finalize negotiations on a trade agreement between Europe and America as soon as possible.
So the name of the book is The Will to Lead, America's Indispensable Role in the Global Fight for Freedom, by a true friend of the United States, former Prime Minister of Denmark, Anders Rasmussen. Thank you very much for being on our show, and good luck to you in your future endeavors.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to talk with you.